Please join me in welcoming Zulema Rubalcava. We are so glad to have you present with us again today. Thanks, Zulema, for being with us.
Thank you, Catherine, and welcome everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to share a little bit of information today. So today we're going to be talking about the ASQ, Ages and Stages Questionnaire, 3rd edition. That 3, the ASQ-3, I usually just drop the 3 because it just means that's the edition that we're going to be that we're on currently. And so when you hear me reference either the ASQ or the ASQSE, I usually just drop the numbers because it gets a little bit confusing. Today, in our time together, we have 2.5 hours, and there's a lot of information, especially if this is the first time you're hearing about the ASQ. So today I want you to be able to leave with being able to describe the features of the ASQ-3, also the benefits of developmental screening, why it is that we ask you or we ask that people start using these questionnaires a little bit more. We're going to talk about scoring, not just how to score, but also how to interpret that score, what it means, what it's looking like. We also want to leave here giving you some strategies for talking with families from start to finish, how to start engaging families in this process, in this system of developmental screening. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what to do next after you screen. So what are some recommendations for follow-up and or referrals, and how do we make sure that children are receiving the supports that they need? Okay, so before we jump into the tool itself, I really want to make sure that we all are sort of on the same page in terms of like some terms that you might hear when we start talking about screening systems. And so the first one is screening. What does that mean? And also you're going to hear a lot about assessments, specifically diagnostic assessments. And I'm also going to be talking about monitoring. So there are really, these are the main 3 assessments or the different types of assessments that are available right now in the early childhood education field. And each of these assessments has a very specific purpose and can be sort of sometimes used or confused and used interchangeably when it's really specific about what they mean. So the first one is the screening, right? A screening assessment. What is this? It is a brief procedure that is used to identify children who we have concerns about, who we might have questions about in terms of how they're meeting milestones and how they're developing. This screening is to help us identify which children need more intensive or diagnostic assessment or evaluation from some of the mandated agencies, such as the regional center or school districts. This is a procedure that is good for everyone, right? So if you think about it in terms of, you know, when, what kinds of screenings have you yourself experienced, right? So if you go to a checkup with your doctor, you might know that before they put you in the room with the doctor, there's somebody there who's, checking your weight, checking your eyesight, your blood pressure, right? All of that is a screening. They're screening to see if things are going the way that they would typically expect to see. There might be something that that pops up for them, right? Maybe your blood pressure is a little bit high. And so they might have questions about that, right? They might want to get more information about why is your blood pressure high? Because, there's a specific standard of what blood pressure should be just with children, right? There's specific ages and stages or milestones that they should be meeting at a certain time. And so if there's questions about why they're meeting this milestone or not meeting this milestone, we want more information. So that leads us to sort of the next level, which is the diagnostic assessment. This is a more in-depth assessment, and it's usually done by a professional.
Zulema,
Yeah.
so sorry to interrupt. Were you needing to share your slides at this point?
I was not. Are you seeing my?
We're not seeing your slides.
Oh no, that's interesting. Oh boy. Okay.
Perfect.
Sorry about that. Okay. So, I mean, you didn't really miss anything much from the other earlier ones. It was just these things. Okay, so this is where I was. Okay. So the diagnostic assessment, this is a more in-depth, and it's usually done by a professional, right? The screening can be done by anyone, right? It's designed to be used for all children and in all settings. A diagnostic assessment is more in depth, and it's usually only looking at that one area of concern or the one or two areas of concern to see what is actually happening in that delay. And it's often also used to to determine if that child is eligible for those early intervention services or early childhood special education services. So really, we should be screening everyone and identifying only a few who might move on to this next assessment step. And so we really want to make sure that these diagnostic assessments are typically a little more expensive, a little more time consuming. And so we want to make sure that we're saving the capacity of the system for the children who really would benefit more from this type of assessment. And so that's why screening sort of helps ease that system and making sure that the most appropriate children are reaching this level so that we can really identify who would be the most beneficial to get this more in-depth, more time-consuming assessment. And then there's monitoring. So monitoring is basically a continuation of both screening and diagnostic assessments, especially for those that were found ineligible to receive services, right? So if you go through the process of getting a diagnostic assessment and they determine that your delay doesn't reach the level of eligibility, it doesn't mean that there aren't any concerns. It just means that they're not yet at the level of eligibility. And so we want to make sure that we are using monitoring, even though it's not a formal assessment. It is something that we can do. So we get the screening, we get the information from the screening, and we continue to just check in over time to make sure that everything continues to either improve or progress, specifically because we know that children are developing so quickly, especially in those first 5 years. If we screen at 6 months and there aren't any concerns, it doesn't necessarily hold that at 12 months, it's going to stay the same. And so we want to make sure that we're screening frequently enough as children grow and develop to make sure that they continue to meet those milestones. But I also want to caution, especially since we're going to be talking a lot about screening specifically, I do want to remind people to remember that screening is not a diagnostic tool. It does not tell us that there's a delay or a disability. It only tells us that there are areas in that child's development that might benefit from increased opportunities to practice some of those skills in those areas. There are some skills that, especially on the ASQ, that are really great to work on, some of those milestones, but also the screening is not something that identifies specific goals or skills. So we really shouldn't just be using the questions on the ASQ to practice for the next time, right? We don't want to sort of, what we say, teach to the test. It's really a way to just get an idea of the general area of development, right? So for example, if there's some concerns in fine motor, right, there's some skills that would be great to work on, like pointing to pictures or threading beads, but we don't really want them to just, that we don't want them to just be able to do the 6 questions so that they, pass the next level. And so we want to use a large range of opportunities in that area so that we strengthen the whole area and not just the specific question on the ASQ. So I also want to talk a little bit about why we screen and why we screen, or why it's important to screen all children, specifically in the families in the areas that we serve here in Alameda County. So these statistics are from California, but what we know is that 1 in 4 children in California are considered at risk. And when I say at risk, you know, it's broad, but some of the things that put children at risk, you know, are experiencing trauma, having, you know, ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. But one of the main things that worries me about what puts children at risk is poverty. So living in poverty is considered a risk factor, and we know we live in an area that has wide disparities when it comes to wealth, right? So if we think about the federal poverty level, right, what is considered living below or living in poverty in the nation, in the United States. So for this year, a family of 4 who makes less than $31,000 is considered living below or living in poverty. We also know that about 10% of Alameda County's population lives below this federal poverty level. But that's not what concerns me. That's, you know, that's concerning, but also we know that in Alameda, you might be considered low income, which is also just the same as living in poverty. For a family of 4, if you make less than $109,000. And so if we think about the families that we serve, it really is something that we should be considering. We also know that in California, even if you're not at risk, only less than 30% of children are receiving timely screenings. And when we say timely, it really is that periodicity, that frequency, right? So it might be that children are screened at 9 months when they go for their well-child visit in in their clinic, but then they're not screened again, right? So so again, like I said, we really want to make sure that we're monitoring children frequently over a period of time. And so only, you know, less than 30% are receiving those frequent screenings. And so we are missing a lot of opportunities. We also know that in California, we're 44th in the country for screening those children that are living below the federal poverty level, right? And so I talked a little bit about who that is in our county. We have about 10% of our population, but even that, we're not doing a great job. And so it is really, I'm always really grateful when I have people show up to these trainings, because I hope that by learning some of the information here, you'll be moved to want to think about how to increase your screening or strengthen your screening, so that we can maybe improve some of these numbers overall for the littlest of us. So let's talk now more about the ages and stages questionnaires, or the ASQ. What are they? They are designed to be completed by families, by parents, by caregivers. And the specific reason, we're going to talk a lot more about this, but it's really wanting to encourage that involvement. We know how important it is to have families involved in their child's development from a young age. And so we really want to make sure that we're using tools that encourage that. They are good for children as young as 1 month all the way to 5.5 or 66 months years of age. So there are specific questionnaires that will encompass all of those ages, right? So you can start screening as young as 1 month. 1 month out of the hospital, there is an ASQ for you. They have a lot of research and backing behind them, so we know that they are incredibly accurate for identifying children who are at risk for having delays, or those children who are not meeting milestones at this time. And because we know, again, like that first bullet there. We know that having a tool that helps us sort of normalize the conversations about child development with families can really increase their participation, right? So these are tools that we can use to talk about development in a way that encourages and validates families and gives them the language, the same language that we have, to talk about, developmental promotion, because it isn't just that we want to identify concerns. We also want to help families learn how to continue to promote, right? And so we want to make sure that we're bringing families along in that conversation. And one of the reasons that it's so important is because we know how important it is to have a universal screening and monitoring program, specifically not just screen, but with a follow-up that is comprehensive and individualized. This will help us promote social equity. We know that children of color, young children of color specifically, tend to have lower rates of supports, even when the concerns are similar. So knowing that young children of color, especially infants and toddlers, they're less likely than all other children in other racial and ethnic groups. So like Black or African American children, American Indian or Indigenous, Asian children, they're all less likely to receive services under IDEA Part C, which is the early intervention part. We also know that toddlers in those same racial groups are less likely to be served under Part B of the IDEA, which is special education from children 3 to 5, right? So Part C, early intervention, is for children 0 to 3, and then 3 to 5 is Part B. We know that that is happening still currently. And part of it can be because we're not offering enough opportunities to screen and to identify concerns as early as possible. And so having a screening program in your center that is really strong will promote that social equity and really be able to make sure that children are able and supported to enter school ready to learn, having supports, having had lots of opportunities to catch up if there are delays. And so when we think about also the diversity of the families that we're serving, we want to make sure that we're also using a tool that reflects that and that helps us, that we're confident can be used across different families and all the different representation that we have in our county. And so the ASQ is really flexible in terms of adapting to different types of families and the cultures of those families. So there are it's flexible in its administration. There isn't just one way to administer the ASQ. It doesn't have to be done, in an interview style face-to-face. It could be sent home. It could be done over the phone. It could be done electronically. It could be done on paper. You can pick it up, put it down, pick it up again, right? It doesn't have to be done, in one setting or in one process. There's also you can swap out different materials that the ASQ uses, as long as you're keeping the intent of the question intact, right? So there are, specific call outs to toys that might not fully represent that culture. And so you can swap that out, right? So there's a question about eating utensils, right? So if your family uses chopsticks instead of forks, you can swap that out to make sure that we're being really representative of all cultures. And then when they did the research behind the ASQ, they also used a diverse population so that they were able to see if this was resonating with families of diverse populations. So we do like the ASQ because it does have a lot of research behind it that shows that it can be culturally adaptable for the diversity of the families that we serve. Also, when we get to the scoring bit, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but there might be some questions that are just really not appropriate for some families and the cultures and the values of that families. So you can omit some of those inappropriate items and still have a score that is valid and gives us plenty of information. So the first feature of the ASQ that I want to talk about is parent report, because typically one of the first questions I get when I do these trainings is, can we trust families? Can we trust parents to tell us what their child is able or not able to do? A lot of times there are some questions about, are families reliable? Is parent report reliable? And I want to be the first one to say yes. There is a ton of research that shows us that families that we can be confident in asking these questions. There is a lot of overlap, especially with the ASQ. So they did some research around the same child having the family answer the questions and having a professional answer the questions. And what they found is that there's about 93% agreement between parents and professionals, right? So if we're looking at the same child, if the family's looking at the child and the professional is looking at the child and we're asking the same questions, about 93% of the time we're going to answer the same. And that's really because the ASQ uses questions that are really there's just higher agreement about what we're seeing, right? So there are skills that are highly observable. So for example, there is a question, and I think it's in the gross motor section, that asks, does your child stand on 1 foot for 5 seconds, right? So that's something that is really not subjective. They're either doing it or they're not, right? And so a lot of the skills are those really highly observable skills. And so that's why we find that there is that high agreement on the ASQ. And what we know is that we might be experts in our field of child development. We might be experts in our field in healthcare settings, but what we know is that parents are experts on their child. And so we really want to make sure that we are giving them voice to that because they do know their children best. We might have them, if we're in the early childhood education field, we might have them, from the time they're young babies, and we might have them for a couple of years and we might know them really well, but guess what? That family is going to have that child for the rest of their lives. And so they really are going to be the experts on their child. We also know that 93% is not 100%, right? And so there's always going to be some differences. And there is research that backs that up, right? So we know that as professionals, especially in the early childhood education field, we might be seeing a lot of children. And so we might start to forget, right, what is typical at this time. And so we might say, well, all these other kids are doing these things. Why isn't this kid doing this as well? And so we might underestimate that child's skills because we're seeing so much difference in different skills. And so we might start to think, okay, well, all children should be doing this. And then forget that, no, actually, this kid always is right on track. We also know that, like I said, there's going to be higher agreement for those easily observed behaviors, and the ASQ does a really good job of making sure that most of the skills that they're asking on these questionnaires are going to be those highly observable behaviors. We also know that families tend to report more emerging skills. So children might be trying new things in a place where they might feel a little more comfortable, where there's not going to be a lot of their friends looking at them, right? And so families might be able to say, oh, well, at home they're starting to do this, even though they haven't brought it yet to school or out of their house. And so it is really important to have those two settings be really represented in those questions that we're asking. Because we know that children do different things in different settings. We know that they behave in a different way in a different setting. There might be other types of materials in different settings that they might have access to. And so we don't want to just only look at the child in one setting. We really want to have the full scope of that child's total ability. And so using a tool like the ASQ really helps us see that child in all of the environments that they're in by asking these questions of the family as well. And then also it's really important to engage families in this process, right? This questionnaire is something that encourages their involvement. If we set up our system in a way that helps them be able to answer these questions easily and in a supportive way. We know the importance of family engagement. We know that especially families who, we know how some families just tend to have an instinct about them. And so we really want to make sure that we're also allowing those concerns to be raised in a way that gives them sort of voice to those concerns, right? So it's validating those families' concerns. We know how important it is to value their expertise and let them know how important their involvement is. We also want to make sure that we're using the tool to create those teachable moments about development. Oftentimes we hear the concern that families just sort of drop their children off at childcare and don't really think too much about what's happening there. And so this is a way to start building on those teachable moments and saying, here's a questionnaire that asks you to observe your child with a very specific lens on their skills. And then we can talk about what that means. We can talk about milestones. We can talk about why it's important to continue to promote. And so it's a really great tool that helps us really engage families and start to bridge those conversations, right? So we really want to make sure that we're having conversations, ongoing conversations about their child's development, and that it becomes a very normal thing, right? Because especially if we're going to be identifying concerns, we really want to make sure that families understand why we're concerned, and also maybe to see if we can bridge those concerns in a way that allows them to see specifically why it's important or why we're recommending some of the things that we're recommending. And we're going to talk more about that in a little bit as well. So that's the number one feature of the ASQ is that family engagement. But now I'm going to talk about the tool itself. In that link that we're sharing in the chat, one of the handouts in that materials folder is an example of a questionnaire. I think it's the 16-month questionnaire. Often I will say if you want to pull it up so you can sort of see it as I'm talking about it. I do have pictures, but sometimes it's a little bit nicer to see it, the tool itself, as I'm talking about some of the features. Like I mentioned, there are enough intervals to cover the first 5 years, right? Starting with 1 month. So these are there's 21 unique intervals, right? Starting from 2 months all the way to 24 months, you can see that these are spaced 2 months apart because we know in those first 2 years, so much is happening. I do see a question about availability in Spanish. Yes, so the ASQ-3 is available, I believe, in 6 languages: English, Spanish, Chinese, both simplified Chinese and traditional Chinese, Arabic, French, and Vietnamese are the 6 questions that the ASQ-3, these intervals are available. Once they turn 2 months, right, we know so much is happening, so we want to make sure that there's a questionnaire that sort of captures all of it. Once they hit 2 years, it starts to slow down a little bit, right? So then the next 4 questionnaires are spaced 3 months apart from up until their 3rd year. And then from 3 to 5, they're spaced 6 months apart. So again, it slows down a little bit more, but there is what we call a window, right? We're going to talk a little bit about that. Some recommendations, however, the 9-month questionnaire was added in this this last iteration, in this last edition, as a way to help healthcare settings, because The recommendations for healthcare settings, guided by the American Academy of Pediatrics, is that in healthcare settings, screening is recommended at the 9-month, at the 18-month, and the 24-month. And so there wasn't a 9-month questionnaire, and so it was added, right? So between the 8 and the 10, there's the 9 months. So the 9-month we typically only use in medical settings. And then the periodicity recommendation is for children between 0 and 2 years old, is that we are monitoring or rescreening every 4 to 6 months, right? Because so much is happening. And then after they turn 2, the recommendation is maybe every 6 or 8 to 12 months. Here it says 6 months, but really the recommendation is every 6 months or 6 to 12 months. And then more frequently if there's concerns, and we'll talk what that looks like. Do I have a website to get all the questionnaires? So if you go to Brooks Publishing, that's where you can purchase them. The ASQ and the ASQ-SE is available to purchase through their publishers, Brooks Publishing. So I'm going to run through these really quickly. So the ASQ-SE, we are doing a separate training on that, but the ASQ-3, their domains, or the areas that we look at, there are 5 domains, sorry. Communication, which is not just what a child can say, but also what they understand. We have gross motor, which are those large muscles in the child's trunk and legs, right? How they're starting to use those muscles to roll over, to sit, to pull the stand, to crawl, to walk, to run, to jump, right? Those big muscles. We look at fine motor, which are the small muscles in your wrists and your fingers, how you use these to do lots of things: feed yourself, dress yourself, play with toys. We look at problem solving, which is how children are in their environment, how they figure out toys, how they figure out their environment. And then we look at personal social, which sometimes gets confused for social emotional, but it's just one facet. So it looks at adaptive skills, which are those self-help skills, how are children learning to become more independent, and then social skills. So how are they able to ask for what they need in order to become more independent. And then there's a whole other tool that looks just at the full social emotional development. And like Catherine mentioned, or Leah mentioned, we have a training coming up in a couple of weeks on that tool, because it is a little bit different. And there's just a little bit different things that we ask in terms of the ASQ-SE and the ASQ. So here is the cover page, right? On this page, this is the first thing that families will see. There are 2 specific features that I want to highlight on this page that are really going to be helpful to us as we start to implement. So these features that I'm going to cover are the ones that are going to be the most useful to know about for your implementation. So the first one is this window of administration, like I mentioned, right? There's 21 unique intervals that you can use for children starting as young as 1 month all the way to 5.5. So how do I know which questionnaire is the one that I should be using depending on the age of the child? And this is the feature that will tell you. So each questionnaire has what is called this window of administration. So you can see clearly for this 16-month questionnaire, the window of administration, so only children who are 15 months, 0 days through 16 months, 30 days at the time of administration. So when you're handing this out, only children who fall within this window should receive this questionnaire. If they're younger, right, maybe they're 14 months and 28 days, they get a different questionnaire on that day. If they are older, right, so maybe they're 17 months, 1 day, they get a different questionnaire. And we'll talk a little bit about how to find out how old children are. And then the second feature is this question around children born 3 or more weeks premature. So up until the age of 2, children who are more than 3 weeks preterm, we want to make sure that we adjust their age. Oh, there's a lot of questions. Sorry, I wasn't scrolling on the chat. Question about if this is used to screen if we have concerns, then why is it now required for QRIS as a screening for all? So this screening, it shouldn't be used if you already have concerns. I mean, it can give you more information. What this tool is a tool to identify concerns, right? So there are some children that you're going to easily be able to identify, right? Those are the children that have really large delays, or, you know, that you already know that there's something going on. Those are the children that, if you're already concerned, you do need more information. You can go ahead and make that that request for additional assessment, that diagnostic assessment, that next level. This tool is for all children, right? We want to know where every child is so that we can use that information to guide our supports, also to identify. So there are kiddos who might be having delays that we just aren't able to identify with our own eyes because, you know, we're not perfect. And this is a more discriminate tool. And so that's why it's designed to be used for all children periodically. Thank you. So this question about prematurity, like I mentioned, this question is only on the questionnaires up until the age of 2. So we know that research tells us that children who are born preterm tend to have some delays. And so we want to make sure that children are given the opportunity, children who are born preterm are given the opportunity to sort of catch up to those children who were born at term. And so we give them about 2 years, and we know that that's usually when most of those delays are resolved, if it's a direct cause of their prematurity. And so after the age of 2, this question isn't on the cover page, but if you're somebody who has a lot of infants and toddlers, then you do want to make sure that we're asking that question beforehand. And so that way we can really make sure that we adjust that age if necessary. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means really shortly. If children have autism, do you still recommend the ASQ? That is a tough question to answer. Typically, children who have autism are already receiving some supports, hopefully. What we know, however, is that autism is a spectrum, right? And so it doesn't all present in the same way. And so we might be able to glean some value, but my sense is that they're also, as part of their supports, getting a lot of observation and monitoring and other sort of tools. So that would be a question that you would want to check in with the family about how useful the information would be. Because again, we know that children who already have disabilities diagnosed tend to get services. But if we see that there might be new things coming out that aren't being addressed through their supports, then we might want to offer this. So it's kind of it's not a black and white answer. It really is, you know, a conversation with the family. If there's new concerns emerging that aren't really being covered, then that might be something to talk about. Okay, so your question is a QRIS question. That is not something that I am as familiar with in terms of like what
you know what QRIS is?
I do know what QRIS is, yeah. But I'm not a part of QRIS, and so I don't know when things change or why they changed or
I guess my question was really just, as you're introducing this, you're talking to it about as using it as a tool. If we if we suspect, right, there may be a delay or there might be a need, and this is a way for us, the way I understood ASQ in the past was that it was a way for us to do a deeper dive with the family. Because you always do, your screenings when you come in, you meet your families, whatever intake interviews you do. So my curiosity was, and I guess you don't know, is why we're doing it now as a requirement of QRIS, and it's part of the scoring system. So you may not have that information.
Yeah, and I will say that for all of the experience that I have with the ASQ, it really is good for all children, not just when we suspect a delay. As you mentioned, it is something that can be used sort of as a way to learn more about that child, right? Even if there aren't concerns, it is a way to just learn more about that child's strengths and skills in progress, so that if you're a child care provider, let's say, or an ECE provider or a family child care educator, it is a way to see where that child is and to think about how we can best support all of the children where they are, right? So we're looking at all of the tools in our belt and saying, okay, well, the ASQ is a way to really start to see where that child is and what I can do to help them grow. Even if there aren't concerns about delays, we might say, okay, well, it looks like these are their strengths, right? So let's say, okay, we'll keep promoting that, but maybe in some areas they might be a little bit slower in developing. And so maybe we put some opportunities in those areas to help them, or maybe we set some goals on our DRDPs or our other sort of child assessments, right? So it is good for all children. And one of the benefits is that as we're learning more about their skills, we might start to see delays that we might not have caught because, our eyes are not robotic. They're not perfect eyes, right? So we might have missed something. I always tell the story about, I was doing one of these trainings with a center director, and she herself had a toddler, a 2-year-old, and as a way to just sort of practice so that she can talk about it with her teachers, she did the ASQ as a family member on her 2-year-old and came back and was like, I was so shocked. He was super delayed in fine motor. I had just never noticed because, I saw him with different eyes. I saw him doing all of these really great things, his strengths, but I noticed that he shied away from fine motor activities. And when I sat and tried to do some of these activities, he really struggled. I didn't notice that because he was so strong in other areas. And so she was able to get him some supports with an occupational therapist, and was able to really start to look at her child and all children with a different view, right? So children are very good at hiding the things that they're not great at, right? And so we tend to miss those kids. And so that's why it's really good for all children, not just the ones that we already have a concern about. Okay. Thank you for that question. So another feature that I like to highlight is sort of this important points to remember. This is on the second page at the top. Once you flip over from that cover page, this is a really great feature, especially if you're if your implementation tends to lean more towards a send home method, right? So you want to send that questionnaire home to families and give them some time. This is a great way to sort of give families some direction about what this tool is and how to complete it, right? So we want to make sure that families understand that this is not a test, right? You can try these things out. We're not trying to get you, right? So if you're not sure, right, there's some questions that might come up where they're like, I don't know. I've never really noticed if they could throw a ball overhand, right? We want to make sure that they're trying that activity. We want the best representation of that child's skills, because that's what's really going to give us really accurate information to then be able to use as a way to support. So we want to make sure that they're trying it if they don't know. Again, also, they don't have to try every activity. There are some things that they'll just know off the cuff. Yes, my child does that. I see them do that, no problem. So I don't need to try it because I'm seeing it. But we want to make sure that if they don't know, if they haven't tried it, to make it a fun game, right? Like this is not something that we want the children to feel like, oh, I have to sit here and like draw a circle, right? Like we want to make it a fun game. And we wanted to do it at a time where that child is well rested, not hungry, not just woken up from a nap, right? Like don't wake up your baby just to try this, right? Make sure that your child is well rested. I don't know about you, but if I am not well rested and haven't been fed, and you ask me to do something, I'm not going to give you my best. Just to be honest with you, I'm not, right? I'm hungry. I'm tired. You get what you get. And that's the same with little kids, right? So we want to make sure that families understand that this should be a fun game. This should be a way to engage in play, which is so joyful. And we want them to know that this is something that we want them to enjoy with their child. It also gives a place to have notes, right? Any questions that they might have to jot down, to remember. And then it gives them some direction about, how long do I have to do this, right? So please return this questionnaire by this date. And you can also say to who. So this is a great way if you're doing this on paper and you're sending it home. Okay, now the areas in the questions. Like I mentioned, there's those 5 areas: communication, gross motor, fine motor, problem solving, personal social. In those 5 areas, there are 6 questions in each of the areas. And the way that we ask families to answer these questions are, yes, this is a skill I see my child do all the time, no problem. Sometimes, this is one of those emerging skills, right? So it's not consistent enough to be a yes, but I see it, it's coming, it's there, so sometimes. And then not yet, this is a skill I have not seen my child do yet. And for some families, we might really want to highlight that yet, right? It's not that they're never going to do it. It's just, it's not there yet. And that's fine. Often when I am introducing this to families, I like to do a little spiel where I say, if it might be that your child is doing all of these things, some of these things, none of these things, and that's fine, right? What this questionnaire is a way for us to learn more about your child's strengths, their skills and progress, and if there's any areas that we can help support or provide more opportunities, right? This is a questionnaire that gives me and you more information about how we can best support this child. In this specific child. And so in order to do that, we really need to know where he is or she is, he or she is, right? So again, we really want to make this normal for families to say children develop at their own pace, at their own time, in their own way. And this tool helps us learn more about who your child is and how they're developing, right? Even within certain families. I always like to say, my niece and my nephew, same family, same opportunities, same environment, 2 totally different developmental trajectories, right? And so that's typical, right? So all children are unique. They all develop at their own pace, and this helps us learn more about your child's specific development in order for us to use it to help them grow to their max potential. Really important to know, especially around implementation, is that these are written in a 4th to 6th grade reading level. All of this to say that we might want to think about how we're implementing and if we're providing enough support. Some families might fall below, might have a lower literacy level than 4th or 6th grade. And for those families, will a send home method be supportive enough? Maybe not. And so I always like to think about how am I going to implement, especially if this is something that you're looking at to improve your system. Think about, do I have a plan B for those families? If the majority of my implementation is a send home method, right? Do I need to provide extra support? How can I provide extra support? What are some things that I can do to make this easy for families to complete, knowing this information? So in those 6 questions, they're ordered in what we call a hierarchy, which just means easy to hard, right? So we know that questions 5 and 6 are always going to be at skill level, right? So for the 16-month questionnaire, questions 5 and 6 are things that a typically developing 16-month-old would be able to do. The first 4 questions are going to be a little bit easier and at a what we call a developmental quotient, which is basically just the skill age level divided by the age of the child, and you get a developmental quotient. So questions 1 and 2, just to sort of make this a little bit easier to understand, questions 1 and 2 are skills that for the 16-month, I'm just going to use the 16-month as an example, because that's what you have in your link. On the 16-month, questions 1 or 2 are skills that we would expect to see a developing 12-month-old would be able to do. And then questions 3 and 4 are skills that a 14-month-old would be able to do, right? And that's kind of the same around all of them, right? So questions 1 and 2 are going to be about 75% of that age. And then questions 3 and 4 are going to be about 88% of that age range. And then questions 5 and 6 are always going to be 100% of that age range. And so they do this for a couple of different reasons. So we know that it's easier to say not yet, and sometimes if you've said yes a couple of times first, right? But it's also a way to, especially if this is a kiddo who's new to your center, to check in on some of those earlier milestones. We know that development builds on itself, and so it's going to be more challenging for children to reach some of those higher skills if they've had sort of delays at an earlier range, right? So you don't get from laying down to walking without a couple of important skills in between. And so if we're laying down and haven't been able to sit up and to crawl, and then we're at the level now where we need to start walking, it's going to be harder because we still haven't mastered those skills yet. And so this is a way for us to go back and say, okay, it looks like around 12 months is when the delay started happening. How do I continue to support at that piece, at that place? Oh, okay. I do want to highlight something too about the ASQ being a very, also for providers who are implementing, the ASQ is a very visual tool. So it also reminds us about implementation, right? And so you might have seen that there's these little lines next to all of the questions in each of the areas. There's these little lines. And then at the end of each section or domain, there's this visual total, right? So depending on how the family answers the question, we're going to assign a numerical point value to that question that then we're going to score up to get a total. And I only mention that because the next section is the overall section. And so you might notice here, in this overall section, once we're done with the 5 domains, we get to this overall section and you don't see that line, right? There is no line next to these questions. And that's because this section does not get assigned numerical values. It is not scored. But it is a really important section because it looks at not just if the skill is present, but how functional that skill is, how the quality of the skill. So for example, there might be a question in gross motor about, does your child walk independently? And a family might say, yes, they walk independently. A question in the overall section might be, do you think your child walks, runs, and climbs like other children their age? And it could be that, yes, they're walking independently, but they're only walking on their tippy toes. And that's something we might want to check out, right? Tippy toe walking can be a marker of a lot of different concerns, or it could be nothing, but we want to know, right? We want to know, is this going to be a skill that's functional? Or not just if it's present, but the quality. This overall section also asks questions around their medical history. We know that health can impact development, and oftentimes as providers, we might not know the full extent, right? It could be that there might be some concerns in the communication bit, right? And if we don't know that this kiddo has had lots of ear infections, that might be impacting their ability to hear and to reproduce sounds, we might not give the right recommendations. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But this is a good section, even though it doesn't get scored. It really helps us get more information that is going to be helpful to us as we interpret some of the scores that we're seeing. We also know that parent concerns, family concerns are very predictive. There's lots of research that shows that families just have a gut instinct. And sometimes it might not be showing up in the scored section, but their concerns are sort of highlighting a need for more follow-up. There's a question. In a 6-month questionnaire, children should be able to do most things as of a 12-month-old. No. So the first 2 questions are skills that a 12-month-old should be able to do. So if you're 16 months, those are skills that you should have already mastered. And then, there's a 14-month question. So you should be able to do skills up to 16 months. They just order the questions that way as a way to see if there's some of those earlier skills that they've mastered already. Like I said, development sort of builds on itself, and so we want to, see if things are if the full developmental trajectory is looking smooth. So because we know that parent concerns are very predictive, anything that is showing a concern should be part of that interpretation, and we should be following up and asking more questions about those concerns. Again, knowing that research shows us that parent concerns can be very predictive. And then the last feature is this summary sheet. Up until now, all of the questions, these are things that we would want to send home to families or have families complete. When we get to this page, this is something that we should not send to families. I don't recommend sending to families. This is for us as a way to get all that information from the family and put it on one place to start to see visually the results of the screening. So this page is for us as providers to really start to see the fullness of all the information in a very easy way. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the different sections of this sheet and how we can use this to help us get a better understanding of where the child is developmentally, right? So there is the top, which is just sort of a place to transfer over the child and family information. There is the bar graph with the cutoffs. And so you might see these 3 different shaded areas in each of those 5 domains. This is what visually is going to tell us where this child is, and we're going to go into more detail about this. But you can already start to see, right, that there's going to be, depending on the score, there's going to be these different areas that they fall into. And that's going to tell us basically where this child is at this time and what we can do with that information. Then we have a place to transfer over the overall section, right? So it doesn't get scored, but we do transfer the information over because it gives us a lot of really good information. So you can also see here that there are different answers that look a little bit different, right? So if it is in bold and capitalized, that's a visual cue that that is a concern that we should maybe also follow up on, right? So depending on their answers, if it's circled, if they answered and it's bold and in capital letters, that's visually for us to know, oh, this is a concern. Let me ask more questions about this. Always there's going to be a section around the score interpretation guidance, right? So what does it mean if the score falls in the unshaded area? What does it mean if the score falls in the sort of the gray shaded area? And what does it mean if the score falls in this darker shaded area? That's the guidance, right? And so it gives us a little bit of ideas. It also gives us some score guidance, right? So if you are coming back to the ASQ for the first time and forgot how to score, the summary sheet is always going to have some guidance around that. And then there's this area that gives you some, some recommendations for follow-up. So based on the score, based on our interpretation, this is what we recommended. We recommended that the child talk to their pediatrician. We recommended that, they go to get further assessment, either through the regional center or the school district, early intervention, etc. And then there's this optional box. Often times we just have a lot of paper, right? And so if we want to maybe cut down on that, or if the family wants to keep the full screening, but we want the results of how they answered all of the questions, this is a place where we can transfer that, right? So here we would, put, depending on how they answered the question, yes, sometimes, not yet, yes, 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 right? And so you could transfer the answers to every single question, all of the 5 domains. It's optional. It's not, most times people will just make a copy, give one to the family, put one in the child's folder, and then we have everything. But if you just wanted to cut down on your paper, but still have a full record, this is where you would do that. Okay, so we're going to go into breakout rooms now. And so given all of the information that I've given you so far, especially around the implementation and especially around family engagement, I want you to work with a partner. So in your group or in your pairs, so you're going to be paired with somebody. I want one of you to take the role of the parent and one of you to take the role of the provider, and role play what it might be like to introduce screening and introduce this tool to your parent. And if you're a parent, what questions might come up for you as your provider is explaining to you? Do you have any concerns about it? Do you have any questions about it? If your mic doesn't work, oof, that's a tough one. I think chat still works, so you might be able to chat your responses. Let's try that first. And I'm going to give you, let's start with 8 minutes and see how that works. Okay, welcome back, everyone. How did that go?
It was great practice.
Mm-hmm.
It was wonderful sharing with Cecilia from San Rafael. We both chatted how we would introduce the program, and it was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Whose parent had an interesting question? Or a question that stumped you?
What are you asking?
Did anybody's parent have a question that was interesting to them, or you've never heard?
Sorry to interrupt, but do you mean like when giving the ASQ and then a parent asks you, or are you?
In this activity.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. I was like, huh?
Yeah, no, in this activity, did anybody's parents have a question that was interesting to you or that you hadn't really thought about before? Katrina, yeah, go ahead, Katrina. I think in the chat, Katrina, you said, what if the parent does not want to complete the questionnaire? That's a good question. I think that goes to your sort of implementation around why. I would have a question about what is it about the questionnaire that they don't want to complete? Is it something that they are, concerned that might, a lot of times families are concerned about, these labels, like if there are, if there are concerns, are they going to be labeled as, having a disability or delay, or will this affect my Medi-Cal benefits? Great question, right? Who gets to see this information? Does it get entered into any system that might impact, the supports I need for my family? That's a really great. Can we make sure that everybody is also muted again? Thank you. Yeah. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of practice, and also, yeah, made you think about it from the perspective of the parent as well. So yeah, so somebody else in the chat is saying that their parent asked if evaluating her, would she be reported as below average, right? So again, these are really great questions. And so when you think about it from the perspective of the family, right, we are hoping that the family is engaged, but oftentimes what we do is we hand this out probably in like a welcome packet or in the waiting room, and there really isn't a lot of explanation for the family about why we're asking these questions. And so that can bring up a lot of anxiety in a family. And so when we think about our system of screening, we always want to make sure that we are that we're explaining the purpose and the benefits. Often what we know is that families might have questions, and if we hand this questionnaire to them and they have questions that maybe are causing a lot of anxiety, they might not want to share information until they feel like they can confidently share information. And so we know that these are some of the frequently asked questions that we get. And often I will use these questions as a way to form my introduction, right? So if I know families frequently have these questions, I sort of front load my introduction with these answers so that I know that at least I'm answering the most pressing ones, right? So for example, somebody asked, what if their family doesn't want to do this, right? I don't have time. Maybe that's why they're asking, right? You're the teacher, you're the one who's the expert in this. Why can't you do it, right? I don't have time for this. I'm very busy. I have other children. And so what I would say is, this is a questionnaire that was designed for families engagement. It's a parent completed questionnaire. You know your child best, right? So it's really important for you to share what you know about your child. I can support you. Do you need more time? Do you need a different language? Do you need some more support? But really, I can't fill this out without you, right? So I can only see what I see, and I really need your information and your observations in order to really support your child as best as I can. This is a question that comes up. Why are you doing this? Why do you want to do this specifically with my child? Are you concerned? Is something wrong? And usually we get this question when we are self-selecting kiddos that we're already concerned about, right? That was one of the questions earlier, is that before we were told that we only do this with kiddos that we're already concerned about. That's why we would get this question. We know families talk, right? We know that they're talking to each other. And one family, if you're self-selecting children that you're already concerned about and you're only giving these out to those kiddos, they might go to another family and say, hey, did you get this questionnaire? And that family might say, no, what are you talking about? And that will heighten their anxiety, like, oh, why did I get it and you didn't get it, right? And so we can avoid this question completely if we use the tool the way it was designed to be used, right, as a screening tool for all children. And so if we design our system by saying, no, this is something that we do with all of our families, we offer this to all of our families, this questionnaire is good for every child, right? We know how important the first 5 years are, especially for their development and their learning. This is when the most growth is happening in their child's brain. And so it's a really great tool for us to check in and make sure that everything we're learning more about where their strengths are, where their skills are, and how we can better support your child individually and specifically. this is one, right? That question around Medi-Cal benefits. Who gets to see this information? What are you going to do with it? Is it going to impact me, right? There's a lot of in the past there was a lot of concerns about families who might be in the process of getting new documentation, or who are undocumented, and there was a lot of fear about being part of systems, right? And so this is also one of those individual questions, right? There are some systems that do require other people to look at this information, but if you are a childcare center, right, there really isn't a lot of other databases, right? So depending on your system, you would really want to be transparent, right? You really want to make sure that families know that you honor their confidentiality and their privacy. And so you want to be transparent and say, this is up to you. This is what I do with it, right? I put it into my files. I put it in my child's, your child's folder. The people who see this are, the teachers in his classroom, or his pediatrician. I can always, there might be, as we're doing this process, there might be some resources in the community that I think might be beneficial for you and your family, that I could recommend to you, but I'm never going to share your information without your permission first, right? And that's a really great way to sort of start to front load that conversation. If there are concerns, if we're starting to see some concerns, and we know that this is a family who we might want to recommend to move on to get more assessments or other resources. And so this is a way to say, hey, there might be some things that I want to recommend to you, but we're only going to do it if we do it together, right? So we're always going to, I'm always going to keep your child's information safe, unless you say I can share it, in order to get supports, right? And so this is a good way to just sort of think about how we're introducing the purpose of this screening, how we're letting families know what we're going to do with this information. And this way, it really just sort of helps relieve some of that anxiety, right? So if you think about it from a family's perspective, some of these questions can fuel a little bit like a test, right? And so what are we going to do with it? Why are we doing this? That's going to, if we front load that conversation, if we share that introduction before we hand them the questionnaire, it's going to help us get the best information and help families feel confident that we're respecting their privacy, that we're building that trust with them, that we're answering their questions, and that we're being transparent, right? And so we want to think about, in our implementation, do we have a way to introduce what this questionnaire is, right? Do we have somebody verbally tell families, right? Maybe at like an open house, right? These are all the forms that we're gonna ask you to fill out before you come to our center. Or if we're attaching it to like a letter when we send it home, anything, right? Any little introduction that answers some of these frequently asked questions can really help and go a long way to having families feel comfortable filling out these questionnaires. So really think about how you're introducing the purpose and the benefits, and giving families a little bit of building that relationship for that next step, right? So we want to make sure that we're considering the family's experience throughout the whole process, before we hand them the questionnaire, while they're doing the questionnaire, and then after the questionnaire is done. How do we continue to engage families in this process in a way that is going to be really supportive for them and for you? Okay. So we talked a little bit about sort of front loading that conversation, that introduction, but let's talk now about really giving the family the questionnaire, right? So everything up until now has been sort of the pre-screening, and now we're going to be actually screening. So we want to make sure that we are giving the most appropriate questionnaire for the age and stage of development. I'm going to sort of go a little bit quickly through this because there's more resources that are a little bit easier, but I want to give you sort of the background of finding a child's age at administration. right? So we want to know how old that child is today, right? If we're handing the questionnaire to a family today, how old is that child today? And so this is what we call the age of administration, and we would get that child's age in months and days that we could then compare to that window that I showed you on the front of the cover page. It's, fairly easy if you like to do math. I don't. But the way that we would do it is we would take today's date, and then we would subtract the child's date of birth in the year, months, and days, and we would come up with their age. If that child is younger than 2 years old and they were more than 3 weeks premature, we would adjust their age, right? So first we would get their age at administration, then we would subtract the number of weeks that child was born premature, and then we would get their adjusted age. In that link that that Leah is sharing, the online calculator is probably the better way, but also there in her materials link, so in the Google Drive, there's also the #1 handout that I recommend to everybody. If there's only one handout that you can download, it's this one. It's the Quick Start Guide. So the ASQ Quick Start Guide is basically this whole training in like 5 pages. And so it'll have this there for you. But really use technology, right? So the online calculator you can use, but there's also an app. So if you go to your App Store or your Google Play Store, you can download this calculator specifically. If you don't want an app on your phone or your tablet, you can go to that link that Leah just shared. And you have the age calculator. It's so nice. You put in today's date, you put in the child's date of birth, you put in the number of weeks they were premature, and it tells you everything. It tells you their chronological age, their adjusted age, and specifically which ASQ and ASQ-SE interval to hand to the family. If you're somebody who does like to do it all longhand using that formula that I shared, but you don't want to go through each of the 21 questionnaires to look at the windows, there's also this handout in that link. It's the administration chart. So if you already know, or maybe your own technology already gives you the child's age, there are some enrollment programs that do that. You can use this chart to just sort of look at let me get my pointer. So you can, if you already know the child's age, you can just look it up here, and it's already broken out to which questionnaire to use if they fall within this range. So once we're sure that the family has been given the most appropriate questionnaire, we send it to them, they fill it out, it comes back. Now it's time for us, right? So this is the after, right? So everything up until now, it's on the family and us to, sort of explain it. But then once it comes back to us, then we start to do our process, right? So how do we score a completed questionnaire? The first thing is we want to go over all of the questions, right? Look them over. If there aren't any missing answers, if it's possible, maybe try to go back to the family and ask why they left that question blank. It could be that they just forgot. For me, the more information I have, the better my recommendations are going to be. And so I always want to make sure that if there's missing answers, that I try to go back to the family and ask about why, and try to get them, maybe they had a question about maybe they had a question about the question, like, what does this mean? I don't know what this is. I don't have this material, so I couldn't try it out, so I don't know, right? And then that way I can help and say, okay, well, here are some crayons. If you didn't have any crayons or writing materials at home, maybe try it out. So once I have all of those answers, then I start to add up the answers based on how the family answered the question by domain, right? So I go to communication, and anytime a family answered yes, I give 10 points to that question. Anytime a family answered sometimes, I give 5 points to that question. And anytime a family answered not yet, I give that question 0. And then I add it up by domain. So I come up with a total for communication. All the 6 questions in communication, I add it up. All the 6 questions in fine motor, I get a fine motor total. I add them up. And then I go over to the overall section, even though I don't score it, right? It doesn't matter. I still read through and see if there's any questions that are signaling a concern. And then that way I can add that to my my interpretation piece, right? So there are questions that that might say a family has concerns about, or health concerns. That's going to help me sort of interpret the scores a little bit easier. It just gives me more information to use for my recommendations. If there are questions that, for whatever reason, the family just deems as inappropriate for their values and their cultures, that's great. We can leave it blank. But then we are going to have to take an extra step when we're scoring, and I'm going to talk about it now, right? So when there are answers that are omitted, right, we don't want to leave it blank and unscored, because if we leave it blank and unscored, it would be as if we were assigning that question, that missing answer, a score of 0 points. And 0 points has a very specific category, right? So 0 points is not yet. Anytime there's 0 points, it means that child is not doing that skill yet. And when a question is left blank, it's not a not yet, it's an I don't know. I don't know. The family doesn't know, the family's not going to know. It might be inappropriate for us to ask that family. So we don't want to give it 0 because it's not really going to give us a good representation. And so what we do is we get an average of the scores to assign that missing question, so that we're not accidentally penalizing the score or the child based on that family's values or cultures, right? So for example, there's a question in personal social that asks about mirror play, right? When you hand your child a mirror, or when the child is put in front of a mirror, does the child hand a toy to you? In some cultures, indigenous cultures, mirror play is highly discouraged for young children. And so we don't want the family to try that question because it's not part of their culture. And so we also don't want to penalize and give it 0 points, because that's just not representative of the child's skills. And so what we do is we get an average of points based on how they answered the other questions, right? So here's how you get an average. You would add up all of the questions that they did answer and get that area score. You would divide it by the number of questions that they did answer, and that would give you an average number of points per question, right? So so once we had that average number of points, we could then assign that to the missing, right? So we would get the same area score, then we would add in this average point, right? We would give this average points to the missing question, and that would give us an adjusted score total. Okay. In that materials folder, there's also going to be this this question. It's going to be a little bit confusing, but let's practice it, right? So having this, knowing how to do this, we're going to do what I like to call a waterfall. So here is an example of a completed area, right? So here's the personal social area. Here's that question around mirror play that I just mentioned, right? And here it is unscored, right? So knowing how to do this, we're going to do it first together, and then I'm going to give you some more resources. But take, the next 30 seconds and score this area for me. Put the score in the chat, but don't hit enter yet, because I kind of want to do what I call a waterfall. So once I think everybody has had enough time to score it and put their score in the chat, I'm going to tell you when, and then at the same time we're all going to hit enter, and you should see sort of a waterfall of everybody's answers. Okay, So let's take 15 more seconds. Get your score in the chat of what you think the personal social total for this example on your screen. What would it be? Okay, and now everybody hit enter. All right. Some people are getting the extra credit. They're giving me the average number and the adjusted score. Some people are just giving me the average score. Okay. So almost everybody is saying 45. There's a couple of people who are saying 54. So those of you who are saying 45, you did not you didn't adjust the score. Those of you who are saying 54, great job. Okay, let's do it together, right? So yes is 10, yes is 10, yes is 10. This one we leave blank. We keep adding all the other ones, 10, 5, right? So here's what it would look like if we left this blank. It would have been a score of 45. But again, that question number 4 is not 0 points. We want to give them credit for this question, right? Based on how they answered all the other questions. And so here you can see almost all of them were yeses, right? So if this was a question that was appropriate to their culture, we can sort of assume based on how they answered all of these questions, right? Their average that, so we would divide 45 by 5, right? So they answered 5 questions. So 45 divided by 5 is 9. So we would give 9 points to this question because we could see, had they answered that question, we could safely say that they probably would have scored about 9 points based on how they answered all the other questions. So now we would adjust our score, right? So we would add it all up again. So now it would be 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 9 plus 10 plus 5 would give us an adjusted score of 54. This is really an important step to take, right? Because it can mean the difference between being in a different cutoff. And if we were to leave it blank and be at 45, we might say, oh, well, it looks like this kiddo is in, below the cutoff and we need more information and we need, to put supports in place. But once we add this, it jumps them up to maybe above the cutoff. And now we aren't that concerned about their development, right? And so it's really important to not leave questions blank and assign them a score of 0. 0 is a specific category. It's not yet, right? And we can't assume that they can't do this yet. So it's really actually a crucial part of scoring is to adjust that score when there are missing items. Also really important is that you can have up to 2 questions per domain missing and still be able to use this adjusted score method. Once there are more than 2 questions, then there just isn't enough information for us to even do that. And that's when we really want to sort of head back to the family and say, hey, I really do want to figure out how to answer these questions because then we just don't have enough information to even know where that child is developmentally in that area. So up to 2, no problem. More than 2, then we can't really make determinations based on the information that we have. So some resources, again, that same calculator has an adjusted score calculator. So if you download the app, it comes with the age calculator and the adjusted score calculator. Also, that link for the age calculator also worked. It also has this adjusted score. So here you would put in which tool you're using, ASQ or ASQSC, the number of missing questions. And it's really nice because with the calculator, it only gives you the options of 0, 1, and 2, no more. And then you would put in that total score of everything that you added up, right? So in this example, I would have put in 45. So I would have put in ASQ-3, 1, 45. I would have hit calculate, and it would have given me the average points, which was 9, and then the adjusted score, which was 54. Any questions on this? Because I want to make sure that I'm being clear about scoring because of how important the score is. One more resource too. So in that quick start guide that I mentioned, on the back page, there's also this little table. This was really important to me when I first started my career as a screener. Often I would be on site at different community settings, and I did not have access to my computer. And I'm going to age myself a little bit. This was also before the time of like incredibly smartphones. And so I might have had access to a calculator, but it was really hard, you know, with your BlackBerry to do it all. So I often would just cut this out and laminate it and bring it with me because it sort of does the math for you the way this calculator does. So here you can see for our example that we just did, right? So I would have had 45 and I would have said, okay, well, there was only one question missing. So here's the adjusted score, 54. If there had been 2 questions missing, it would still be 54. But if say the area score was 35 and they had 2 questions missing, then this would be the score. And here you can also see there's only options if there's 1 question missing or 2 questions missing. Again, this is a reminder for us that we can only skip 2 questions per domain and still have a valid score based on this adjusted score method. So here is an example of a completed sheet, right? So we're going to use this little guy, Andrew. I'm going to talk about him as if he was a real kiddo, right? He did the 16 months. And here are his scores in those areas. And we can already start to see visually places where we would start, right? Where we would start interpreting. So we know that he has a couple of scores that are in this gray shaded area. So just to give a little bit of context, anything that's in this unshaded area means at this moment, at this time, appears to be meeting milestones like other children their age. This gray area is what we call the monitoring zone. Basically means meeting milestones, but at a slower rate, and we might want to monitor, we might want to look at that a little bit deeper. And then everything in this unshaded area, fortunately, Andrew doesn't have anything below the cutoff, right? So we call this below the cutoff, basically tells us that at this moment, not meeting milestones, we might want to get some more information, some more assessment to let us know why they're not meeting milestones. We can also see that there are a couple of questions where the mom is indicating some concerns, right? So here, right, sometimes he ignores me, doesn't say many words, right? And what we're seeing at communication, that might be something that we might want to check in on, right? Grandmother has a hearing aid, ear infections, allergies, and with this, right, something that we might want to ask more questions about. What does that mean? Is this impacting this, right? Is he ignoring, or can he just not hear her? Really important here. Family indicated yes, other concerns, but no comments. What other concerns? What other concerns are there? Maybe family didn't want to put it to paper. Maybe they're waiting to say it verbally to me, right? So this is where we sort of start the process, right? Everything up until now has just been paperwork. And this is where screening begins, because we don't just want to get these scores and say, okay, great, thank you, see you in 6 months, right? The whole purpose of screening is that follow-up, is using that information to support and promote that child's individual development. And so we want to take in this information and process it and interpret it and come up with some recommendations that are best going to support that kiddo's development, right? And so what we know is that when we have a screening, we start with this information. We start with their area scores, and we start with the overall responses. But what else might we want to do, right? What are some other things that are impacting? Or what are some other factors that might impact? Feel free to call them out or put them in the chat. what might, and if we want to use Andrew as an example, what might we have, what questions might we have of that family, right? So we saw some of their overall responses around ear infections. We saw some comments about sometimes he ignores me, doesn't say many words. Family has a history of grandma uses a hearing aid, right? What else might we want to look into, or what questions or what factors might be impacting that child's results? Parent bias, say more. So parents maybe not seeing the concerns, or seeing their skills in a different way. Yeah, hearing test. So health, biological or health factors. Yeah, where does this child fall in their family? Often, a lot of times, the youngest child in the family is spoken for and not spoken to. So yeah, everything gets done for them. Might not, yeah, opportunity to practice some of those skills is definitely environment, socialization, absolutely. Is that something that we can look at, right? What are their opportunities? What is their environment? What are the things in that environment that might impact, right? All of these are really great things that we might want to bring up as we're having conversations with families. Lifestyle, yeah, has this child recently had changes in their lifestyle, right? Is there history of the family? Yeah, so what is the developmental history, right? Is this a bilingual family? Are we asking the right questions of this child, right? Being bilingual doesn't correlate to speech delays, but it does give us information about, you know, are we asking these questions in a culturally sensitive way? I don't know what SES stands for. I'm sorry. Can you double click socioeconomic status? Oh, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Availability of resources, right? Some of these questions ask about materials and whether or not that child has had the same opportunities, right? Socioeconomic status, right? Especially around communication. Do they have access to books, songs, time to read books, time to sing songs, time to play? All of that is part of that bigger picture. And so we want to make sure that we're not just taking the scores at face value, but that we're using it as a way to interpret what else might be going on for this family and what is going to best support this child's development, right? So in the case of Andrew, right, we saw that that there was a delay in their communication, and we might say, okay, well, let's read more songs to him, or read more books, let's sing more songs, let's give them more words, even because mom said doesn't appear to have more words. Okay, well, let's inundate him with words. But if we had failed to see that that health history, right, if we didn't look at that family history of hearing aids, right, we might want to say, well, at what age did grandma get that hearing aid, right? Is it because she's grandma, or has she had it her whole life? Is this something, you know, we know that certain things might run in families a little bit, especially health conditions. And so we might want to ask more questions. Well, what does it look like when he's ignoring you? Is he looking at you face to face, or is his back turning? He just can't hear you, right? So then that way, no matter how many words we give them, no matter how many songs we sing, if they can't hear, they're going to have a harder time expressing, right? So there's that receptive piece. Can they hear? And then can they say? So those are some of the really great, so you guys are hitting everything right. So we want to ask these questions as we're looking at this. We want to use all of the information so that we can really come up with some best recommendations, right? So had we just gone with the score and said, okay, well, in communication, let's give them more words, that really isn't going to support this kiddo, this specific kiddo. It might support another kiddo who is also having some communication delays. But this specific kiddo, we might have to do a couple of steps before. We might have some questions before. Have they had a hearing aid or a hearing test? No? Might we get that first, right? Especially because of those allergies, because of those ear infections. Is it impacting their ability to hear? If it's not, great, then we move on to the next step and say, okay, well, maybe it is that we need to give them more opportunities to practice. So all of this just is to say that we want to start the screening where it is and then add on to it, right? So it's screening and follow-up, screening and recommendations, right? It's not just screening. We want to make sure that the information that we're getting is going to help us really support and promote this child's development. We also want to take into consideration a big portion of this, which is family and cultural value and context. Often this is where a lot of those what we might call, or what someone has called parent bias and parent denial, often will fall in this category, this cultural context of the family. And so we always want to make sure that we're asking those questions again in a way that's really respectful and that values that heritage and that culture of that family. But we know that there are different factors that can impact, right? So each family has their own specific context around communication, right? So some families might value quietness and silent, right? Children are to be seen and not heard. How often have we heard that? Other families are really great with being loud and being communicative, and that's something that is part of their context, right? So we might want to take that into consideration. A family's environment or geography where they live. We know that there are neighborhoods in our county that might be a little harder to be outside in, right? So geography, is there a safe place for kiddos to play? They might not be able to go to the playgrounds because they might not be very safe for families. And so maybe in their environment, they live in a smaller space where they don't have the opportunity for some of those large motor movements, stairs, climbing, toys, and they can't take them to a place in their neighborhood because, again, it might not be safe for that family to be there. Also, there could be a lack of materials, right? Because of some of their socioeconomic status. Again, that environment, they might not have reading materials or learning toys. So we want to ask family these questions, right? Have they had the opportunity to practice some of these skills? How often do they go out and play? And if not, what can we do to help bridge some of that context for that family? Values and beliefs around child development is a huge one. Also traditions, right? So in some families, it could be that they just have more stronger oral traditions, right? So we might not be seeing a lot of books, but we might be hearing a lot of storytelling. And so that might impact, fine motor, right? If a child doesn't have books, right, their communication might be great because they're getting all of this oral storytelling. But we want them to practice flipping pages as well, right, for those books. But that might be something that we might not know if we didn't ask. What is your family's traditions around book reading or storytelling? What does it look like at home? Some values and beliefs around certain toys, right? And what toys, who gets to play with what toys is often part of that conversation as well. The ASQ has questions around dolls, around balls, around cars, and there might not be access, right? So these types of kids don't play with dolls or are not encouraged to play with cars. So we really want to make sure that we're asking, again, that context of what the family how they might be answering some of that bias, right? And parenting practices, what are their expectations of development? Certainly, especially around personal social, right? Dependence or independence. Some families value codependence more than independence, right? And so this might be coming up in the context of feeding skills, dressing skills, right? It's not that the child can't feed themselves, it's just that their parenting practices and their values supersede that skill, right? In this family, we feed our children until they go off to school, right? That's how we show our bond and our relationship and that's how we build our relationship, by me doing for instead of encouraging independence. And so that's something that we want to take into account and, again, bridge those conversations within that family's cultural context so that we can understand more about why some of the ways that they answered the questions. Again, we don't want to miss the forest for the trees, right? So again, this questionnaire is to help us identify concerns and not to, ping the families for not valuing the same things that we value. We don't want to do that. We want to understand why they value the things that they do and how do we get to a place where we can learn more about each other and figure out how we can work together to promote some of these skills in a way that is really representative of their own values and cultural context, so that we can really support them in that process. And we're not going to know that unless we ask some of these questions. Yeah, especially because a lot of the questions in the ASQ might have questions that can be impacted because of some of these topics, right? Nursing, feeding, sleeping, disciplining, all of it, screen time, all of it. So usually what I do is when I get this and when I start to interpret, anytime there's a question of a child is not doing something yet or isn't doing it consistently yet, I always want to ask, why not? Why? Because that's really going to help me start to think about what next, right? So not yet, why not? What next? Opportunity to try items appropriate for that child's cultural context, family values. Always want to be asking those questions. Let's talk a little bit about the cutoff scores, because that will also give us more information about what it is that we're saying when we say a child is above the cutoff, in the monitoring zone, or below the cutoff. Usually when there's an assessment, there is sort of this bell curve of results. And so you might see here in a general population who does any type of assessments, but specifically the ASQ, we're going to use that. We'll have the population sort of fall within this bell curve, right? There'll be a small percentage of kiddos that are what we would consider, not above average, but meeting all of the scores. There might be a percentage of kiddos that, are a little bit above average. And then there's this group of kiddos that are right at, average. And then the same is true for this side, right? So there might be some children who are a little bit below the average, the mean, right? So not meeting skills at the same rate or at the same level of other kids. And then there's kiddos who are below average or not meeting milestones, right? So these are the cutoffs, right? So this is a little bit off because the 60 should actually be here. This is where the 60 is. So if a child said yes to every single question in every single domain, they would get 60 points in communication, 60 points in fine motor. All that we're saying is that they are here. This is where they are, right? They're right at average level. It could be that they're here and here, but the ASQ is not for these kiddos. The ASQ is really for these kiddos. And so this is where the cutoffs are, right? So here is where above the cutoff would mean, right? And then the monitoring zone starts in this 1 standard deviation from the mean. So this is where the kiddos who are in that gray shaded area, what we call the monitoring zone, this is where that cutoff is, right? 1 standard deviation from the mean. And then anything below the cutoff is this 2 standard deviations. And so these are the kiddos that we want to try to identify so that we can put supports into place that hopefully will bring them back over here. Because this is ultimately where we want most of our kiddos. We want them to thrive doing the skills that other children can typically do. So again, this is where the cutoff scores are held. So that gives you a little bit of information about where these children who fall within these scores, what that's telling us is that these are the kiddos who are not even here, right? They're here and here. Okay, so when we think about our system of screening, we want to always think about the what next, because screening isn't helpful unless you have that what next, that follow-up piece. It's really important. It's screening and follow-up, not just screening. So when we think about using a screening, a questionnaire like the ASQ, and what I just showed you with the cutoffs, we want to think about the different results that we might see, and then think about what recommendations we might have if a child falls within those results, right? So this is a very sort of generic screening and follow-up system, I guess, that you can use sort of as a template to start thinking about what might help us, right? So make recommendations, right? So we want to start with the score, right? We have the scores, we have the overall, and then use our own interpretation about, use our observations, use those questions to come up with where this child is and what to do next, right? So there's going to be a section of children where we're just not going to have a lot of concerns, right? The scores are telling us there's not concerns. Our observations are telling us there aren't that many developmental concerns. Families aren't sharing any concerns, right? So there really isn't a lot of risk at this time, at this moment, right? We're not saying that forever, but like at this moment, there just aren't that many concerns, right? So those are the kiddos that we might want to say, okay, well, let's just continue to monitor, right? We'll come back in 6 months, we'll come back in a year. So we're going to continue to rescreen. We might give you some ideas of how to continue to promote, right? So some activities to try at home for the next stage. We might say, hey, if you want to learn more about, parenting practices, here's some support, here's some resources, right? Really easy group of kids. We just want to continue to do what we're doing, continue to promote, and then come back and rescreen at a later stage and see see where they are then. Then we're going to get sort of this group of kiddos who are exhibiting some concerns, right? But we're just not sure. Maybe we've talked to the family and we're saying, hey, it looks like they could probably use some more opportunities to practice these skills, right? Maybe they just haven't had that opportunity. Again, like we mentioned, maybe they don't have those opportunities for those large gross motor, and so we might be seeing some concerns in gross motor, and so we might want to say, okay, well, let's figure out a way to practice some of these large motor skills, right? So let's try these activities out for, let's say, a couple of months, right? 2 months, and see if all of this extra practice is really helping meet that concern, right? And so we want to observe and monitor, right? Put some targeted interventions into place, and then re-screen at a much earlier stage, right? So it's not like, let's wait until the next interval. It's like, let's use these interventions, let's observe, and let's see if it's helping to move the needle in terms of their delays, right? If it is, right, say we put these targeted interventions in place, we come back, we rescreen in 2 months, and hey, guess what? Everything looks great now. Then we say, okay, now we put you back over here. We offer some more parenting support. We say, okay, we screened again, but we're going to screen in another 4 months, and we're going to continue to put these interventions into place, right? Or we say, hey, you know what? It looks like after all this practice, after all these interventions, we're still not seeing a lot of improvement. And now we might have some more questions. And so we've tried some things out, doesn't appear to be working. We need more information. This might be a kiddo that we then say, okay, well, the next step is to get that more information with that diagnostic assessment. And then there's going to be a group of kiddos who we automatically know, right? A lot of concerns, family's concerned, we're concerned, the screening shows us concerns. That's a kiddo that we're just gonna, we're gonna say, okay, we just need more information right off the bat. Let's go ahead and make that recommendation for that diagnostic assessment. That's not where it ends, right? The diagnostic assessment also can have a couple of different outcomes, right? So the first one is that they are not eligible. Not that there isn't any concern, just that that level of concern doesn't yet reach the level of eligibility. Those kiddos are going to be a little bit challenging because we're going to try to figure out, well, what else can we do? Because the concern exists, but that assessment tool doesn't make them eligible for any of those mandated services through early intervention or early childhood special education. So we're going to, try to go back to our tool belt and say, okay, well, are there other assessments that we can use to continue to monitor? Are there other agencies that might be able to provide some of those bridge supports or give us more supports, right? So there might be other areas in the community that can help connect families to other types of supports or other things that might help support that concern. Or the other outcome is that after the assessment, they are found eligible and are now put into that system of early intervention and are getting supports to meet those delays. So when we think about our own system, we kind of want to use something like this, right? So do we have an idea of what types of recommendations we're going to make for children at every sort of point of results, right? What are we going to do with these kiddos, these kiddos, these kiddos? Do we know where to send them for this? Do we have enough connections in our community for this? And if we don't, where can we find this information? Or what can we do to get better connected? And so I want to talk a little bit about that. Oh my goodness. These are just very, again, generic examples of things that we can do, right, at each of the 3 levels, right? So parenting supports, give them more information about how to promote play at home, right? So these are things that you can find on that Ages and Stages website where you can find the calculator. They have these activities sometimes in multiple languages. Here you can also see Ages and Stages. These are nice. They don't really require a lot of detailed materials or, specific toys. They could be things that, put things in a laundry basket just out of reach, right? Let's sing songs together. As we're walking around, let's play what's that? Let's point to things and see if a toddler can name them, right? So these are things that you can just do automatically. This is not the only thing that exists, but it's a good place to start. The ASQ-3 learning activities, this is something that you can purchase. And it's also really nice because it gives recommendations for specific ages in the specific domains. So, if you have if you want to give families some more information about things to do just in fine motor for a 2-year-old, there's a handout specific to that. And then for that sort of ongoing or referral assessment, right? If you don't know where to connect children to diagnostic assessments, or, if you're not sure, we always recommend Help Me Grow as a place to start, right? Helping families connect to a care coordinator who can give them more information, learn more about their needs. And I'm going to talk more about Help Me Grow in a little bit. But these are just the types of things that we might want to start putting in our tool belt, right? In our system as we're thinking about our implementation. Do we know what recommendations we might need? And this is not the end all be all. This is just a start, right? There might be things that you're already using, right? There might be parenting groups that you already have connection to, or family resource centers that are clear by. Libraries are a great resource, right? Do you know where your closest library is? And have you recommended families go there? That's always a good place to start as well. Or family resource centers. I know that we have a couple of them in our county that also do a lot of really great parenting support. They have classes, they have parenting education, they have parenting groups. A lot of them also in multiple languages. So, start to really think about what recommendations you're making and what more you might want to expand, what more offerings you might want to expand for families so that we can really make the best recommendations for these kiddos. And so when we come to sharing this information with families, we also want to think about the best way to do this, right? So we want to make sure that families are sort of, we're circling back to families. So they've done, a lot of the work in giving us this information, and we're doing a lot of the work interpreting this information. And then together, we're going to talk about the what next, right? We want this to be a collaborative tool. And so we want to come to the family with our own observations and with our own questions, but also give space for the family to have their own questions answered or give their own recommendations. Families are also a wealth of information. They might have already been connected to certain things that we might not even know about, right? Spiritual groups or spiritual centers, right? Churches, a huge resource to families that often as providers, we don't tap into enough, right? There could be a lot of different resources that they're using that we might not even know about. And so we really want to have this be a conversation and a collaboration. And so all families, regardless of the results, we're going to try to come up with a way to together decide what makes sense for that family, right? Learning activities for home or school, they might say, hey, at home, we do a lot of this and it helps them with this, with this skill. And so we might share back and forth, right? Here's what we're doing at school. Here's what you're doing at home. How can we work together to make sure that we're doing it all in the same way or supporting in a way that's going to help? We might make recommendations, right? If we're doing screening in a healthcare setting, and we're seeing some concerns, we might say, hey, it might be a good idea to talk to your childcare provider, your early education, educator, or your family childcare educator, because this is what we're seeing. Or if you're in early childhood education, you might say, hey, it might make sense to talk to your pediatrician. There are, especially if it's like a health concern, there are resources that might be open to them through their insurance. That we might not have access to as a ECE educator. Also, like I said, sharing community resources. Families might know of different resources in their community that we might not know about. And again, we might also know, right? Like, do you know where your library is? Do you know that they have story time that you can take them to? You can get a library card and get as many books. If you are a family that can't buy books, go to the library. There's tons of books that you can get for free for a period of time, right? With a library card. That library card opens doors. There's also that library card will often give you tickets to museums, tickets to other places like the zoo or Fairyland with your library card. So families might not be able to access the zoo because of, lower, low finances or low income. But that library card, you can get free tickets, free access to the zoo. And how would that really impact their child's development? Again, so really we want to make sure that families are aware of all of these resources, that we're aware of these resources, or that we know where we can go to get more information about those resources. We also want to make sure that as we're having these conversations, especially if we're seeing some concerns, but again, with all families, we want to make sure that we're planning for language issues. Do the families speak the same language? Do they prefer somebody who speaks their home language? Are we having these conversations in a place that is private, right? We don't want to be having these conversations where there are other families around, where there's other kids around. We also want to have these conversations with enough time. We know that the system of getting diagnostic assessments can be slow. There could be wait times. And so we don't want to wait too long to share those results, especially if there are concerns. We always want to start by celebrating the child, right? Always starting with the strengths. Because if we start with the concerns, I guarantee you, if we start with concerns and then we move on to everything else that the child is doing, for the most part, that family's not going to remember the strengths. They're only going to be focused on the concerns and what that means for them and everything that's going to come with that, right? So every child has strengths, every child has things that they're good at. And so we want to start with celebrating that child, starting with that, with those strengths, reviewing the questionnaire, reviewing the concerns. We don't want to use terms like passing or failing. I know that sometimes in healthcare settings, that's just the language that we have to use. But when we're talking to families, we want to use friendly languages. I don't even use above cutoff, monitoring zone, below cutoff, because what does that mean for a family? Not much, right? So I want to use terms that they'll understand, right? So strengths, these are the things that your child is doing really well in this area. Skills in progress, these are things that we're, keeping an eye on because we want them to practice this a little bit more. These are things that we want to start looking at. We might have some questions about why they're not able to do some of these skills, opportunities to practice, right? And again, always making this a conversation. One of the things that I hear most is when there are concerns, right? When we know that there's a family that we might want to make that recommendation for referral to further assessment, right? That conversation tends to be a little bit hard or challenging or difficult to have with families, right? There are a lot of different things that we want to talk about. And so I usually approach these conversations as if I'm walking up a staircase, right? So you see this nice staircase. And usually when we walk upstairs, what happens? We all start here at the bottom, at the first step, right? So we all come into this conversation at the same point, often when we think, okay, well, when we're preparing to have this conversation, no concerns, no desire to refer, right? And then as providers, we go through that whole process of interpretation, our own observations, right? Coming up with our own sort of ideas. And we say, okay, well, this is a family that I think we need to refer on. And often when we start this conversation, we jump directly to that, right? When we're having that conversation with the family. And so if you think about it, you say, okay, if I'm a family and I come into this conversation at the bottom of the stairs and then somebody is really quickly pulling me to that top of the stairs, that can be scary. That can make me want to take a step back. That can make me want to be like, no, I don't want to go up there, right? I'm here. I'm nice and comfortable down here. I don't want to walk up these stairs. And so I think about all of the different steps that I can take to help me walk up these stairs with this family, right? In no particular order, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because I know we're sort of running late on time, but we want to make sure that we're using our active listening skills, right? That we're listening with respect and with empathy. We're not making judgments about whether that family or why that family is in denial, but we want to respect, right? There might be other things going on. We want to give that family information, check in, right? It might take a couple of different conversations to get there. Addressing the fears. A lot of times families will say, oh my gosh, does my child have autism? Are they going to be labeled, right? Are they going to, not be able to do all of these things? A lot of these systems have hurt families in the past. And so we want to address the fears and say, I understand. I don't know, right? But I understand where you're coming from. I understand your fears. And together we're gonna do it. We're gonna walk up these stairs together. We're gonna go through this process together. You have somebody that you can talk to. Giving them more information about development and services, right? If I say I want to make a recommendation for early intervention, what does that mean? Who provides it? What does it look like? Where is it? You know, is it going to come to my house? Do I have to go somewhere? All of this can help families sort of walk up these stairs together, right? When you start having these conversations, you know, take cues from the family. Do they look relieved, right? Often families will be like, oh, thank God somebody else is having these concerns. I thought it was just me. Or are they like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't see that, right? So then we sort of gauge where we are, where the family is, and how we approach these conversations. I do want to sort of put a little plug in. It's not our job to convince the family that they need this referral. It's our job to provide the information and let the family make that decision based on their own needs, right? So we want to make sure that we're giving them all of the options, giving them multiple options, right? There's not one way to do this, but giving them other options and then coming in and checking, right? Validating their concerns, validating their autonomy as a family, and making the decision that's best for their family. And, you know, and then we can continue to support what we can support. So I do have a training coming up that dives way deeper into having difficult conversations. So with that said, I do want to do a really quick, I'm not going to show the video, plug for Also Help Me Grow. So I talked about getting more information about some of these services. This is the place to go, this phone line. You can call it, or you can have your families call it. You as a provider can also check out our resource directory. It has tons of programs that you can check out. We also have a Connection Cafe actually coming up in a couple of weeks. Go on our website if you're interested. This month's topic is mental health for families. And there's going to be a lot of great resource sharing and networking. Our listserv, if you get on our listserv, we send you a list of upcoming trainings, upcoming groups, upcoming activities that you can send your families to. And then we also do support providers around this system, or connect you to more training and more technical assistance. Oh no. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, because my what's just okay. And some upcoming trainings that we're going to have, right? The ASQ-SC. So if you want to learn about the companion tool of this ASQ and learn more about social emotional development and how to identify concerns. We also have a learning lab coming up in October. So we're going to give you some time to try these tools. And then we're going to, if you want more a free time to ask specific questions, that's where the learning lab is. We'll have some activities to practice, some conversations that you can use to help enhance your system of screening with the ASQ and the ASQ-SC. And then, like I mentioned, we have our having difficult conversations coming up in November. And that one is going to be a really reflective training on having some conversations with families when there are concerns, when we have developmental concerns or behavioral concerns. How do we have these conversations in a way that's not only supportive to the families, but also to you as a provider? Because often this is the hardest thing that you're going to have to do, is have those conversations. And so we want to give you some space and some strategies for having those difficult conversations with families. Ooh. And here's my information. Please feel free to reach out to me. I am also a resource to you. I love talking to people about setting up systems. I have a lot of experience
providing technical assistance, where I can really look at your strengths as a provider, as an agency. And I have a lot of experience across systems, right? So I do a lot of work in pediatric settings. I do a lot of work in ECEs, or I have done a lot of work in ECE settings, just to sort of get an idea of what capacity you have and how we can use that in order to improve or strengthen or enhance your own screening system. Thank you so much. I hope to see you soon, or feel free to contact me, and hopefully you'll come to one of my other trainings, the ASQSE or the Having Difficult Conversations. I know that we're a little bit over time, but I can stick around if you have any specific questions right now. I can stick around for a little bit longer and answer those.
Thank you so much, Zulema, for this wonderful training that you hosted today. Again, thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you in our future upcoming trainings. The link to all the materials for this training can be found again in the chat. Again, thank you again, and see you next time. Have a great day.